Welcome to the Meru Media Podcast with Mukunda.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Meru Media Podcast. We have a fantastic episode for you today. Honestly, two of the giants in the field of Dharma Shastras and Hindu law and Dharma generally are joining us for an interview and conversation. We have with us Professor Patrick Olivelle and Professor Donald Davis, both at University of Texas, Austin. I dare say they are the inheritors of P.V. Kane's vast amount of work, and they've taken that up in earnest and done a fantastic job. Professors, both of you, welcome to the podcast and welcome to the program.
Thanks.
So, it's been a long time. I've been thinking about having you guys on, and I had to go back and brush up on my readings of your works for the past 20 years, and try to find time between work and family life. And it's been fascinating to do that. And I have to say, a large part is because I love your work, both of your works, because I think, unlike what I find with a lot other scholars, there's an objectivity you guys bring to the study of the texts and the study of both the textual sources and in fact, like the epigraphic evidence and evidence of later texts and understanding that I feel like is missing today. The objectivity of trying to understand how these texts would have played out in the past, instead of imagining the past from today as being the locus. I do appreciate honestly the rigor and the scientific acumen you guys bring to the table. So thank you for that amazing scholarship. So let's start with Professor Olivelle. Professor, how did you get into wanting to study Indology? It's such an obscure field for most people. How does that come out to you?
A series of happy accidents.
And would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I was initially supposed to be working on Buddhism, believe it or not, and I went to Oxford to do some Buddhist work, but ended up working for the Sanskrit honors program with Pali as a second language. Then I came to the University of Pennsylvania, where I thought I would do a PhD in Buddhist studies. But the people who were doing that kind of work there were not that welcoming. And I ended up working with Professor Ludo Roche, who was my teacher there. And the rest is history, I say. So I went in a somewhat different direction, but that's okay.
So what's your background? I'm assuming you're from the subcontinent of connection.
I'm from Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka, okay. So obviously that connection would make sense for the
Right.
Learning Pali and Buddhist studies. So before we get to what appealed to you about, particularly about Dharma Shastras, Professor Davis, what's your background? I'm sure exposure must have been coming first in college to this stuff, as opposed to lived life.
So I came through study of India through anthropology, which I had studied as an undergraduate, and through anthropology got interested in India. My early anthropology professors happened to work in India, and they introduced me to South India and Tamil and Sanskrit and things like that. And I ended up taking Sanskrit one year as a junior in college, and decided that I was more interested in India than in anthropology. And so then I was encouraged and was glad to start graduate school, and ended up working under Dr. Olivelle and Dr. Lariviere down at the University of Texas. So my story is also a little circuitous, but also not so dissimilar, happy accidents along the way.
Well, I mean, both those are interesting paths, and so I think it's interesting insofar as Dr. Olivelle, like what pulled you to study Dharma Shastras, as opposed to trying to study, for example, like the Buddhist ideas of Dharma or the Buddhist social and moral ethical framework. You touch upon parts of this in your work, but what drew you more to the Dharma Shastra tradition?
Well, actually, my very first book, which is a very little tiny one, which I wrote as a thesis in Oxford, was about the Buddhist monastic discipline and the early history of Buddhist monastism. But when I came to America and started studying here, my first area of work was Brahmanical texts on the ascetical tradition, the sannyasa tradition, which is sort of the parallel to the Buddhist tradition that way. And actually within the Brahmanical literature, not all, but most of the Dharma Shastric work, most of the work on asceticism, on sannyasa, were part of the Dharma Shastric corpus. So, for example, in many of the later medieval texts, there will be a section called Moksha Kanda.
Yeah.
And the Moksha Kanda deals with actually is the life of a sannyasa. So that was my first entree. So I started working on that, and then gradually moved into sort of mainstream kind of Dharma Shastric work when I was teaching first at Indiana University for 17 years in a religious studies department. But when I moved to Texas, I had my colleague who was with me in graduate school too, Richard Lariviere, and we together started working on a critical edition of the Manu Smriti, the text on Manu. And then, so gradually I moved into that area of editing the major texts of the Dharma Shastric tradition. Yeah.
So where did your commentary or your translations of the Upanishads fall in this journey?
That was a very, very, again, happy accident. Never intended to do that. What I did was, a while back in the late 1990s, I did a translation of a set of Upanishads called the Sannyasa Upanishads, which were published by Oxford University Press in 1992, I think, something like that. And then the editor of the series in Oxford called the World's Classic series, this large World's Classic, contacted me and said, would you mind doing translation of the main Upanishads? And I initially said no, because I had never done that work. But they were insistent, and I said, okay, I'll take the winter break and try to translate a portion of a major Upanishad. And I got interested in it, so to speak, and ended up doing a translation for them. Yeah, right. That was mine. Was
that your first real interaction with the Upanishads, or had you read them before? Or?
Well, of course, I've read them before, because you do that in any case in your graduate work, in other work. But this was the first serious engagement with the ancient Upanishads that I had. And I had to deal with it also in a critical way, not just translating, but looking at both the linguistic sides and the editorial side and the various variants that are there. And then that produced my second volume, which contained the text and the translation in 1998 or something like that I translated. And my colleague, Joel Brereton, who was here with me, was very helpful, because he knows a lot more about the Upanishads and the Vedic literature than I do. And he was very helpful to me at that time of my life in the 1990s when I was doing this translation. Yeah.
And then, so Professor Davis, what drew you to studying the law? I mean, because a lot of your work is really focused on the legal concepts within the texts, as opposed to just purely Dharma as Dharma. It's a little more pointed. So what drew you to that area?
So I think that I had aspirations once upon a time to go to law school and do these kinds of things when I was an undergraduate, and somehow I think that the Dharma Shastra became the substitute for that. But it was also under the influence of some of my teachers. So we've already mentioned Professor Lariviere a couple of times, and his interest also shaded over oftentimes into using Dharma Shastra as a way to understand some portion of the history of law in India. And I'm drawn to areas of research that are somewhat understudied. Mm-hmm. And so I felt that it's a kind of a cliche, and one that we often work against in contemporary South Asian studies, that India is a religious place, right? The empire of the spirit and this kind of thing. And so I'm always interested in ways of highlighting aspects of the history of India that are not necessarily religious, or at least not exclusively so. So the law became the sheer extent of legal thinking and jurisprudence in Sanskrit is so vast that it makes perfect sense to try to bring that sophisticated intellectual system to a wider audience. And that is something that I have spent my time doing over the last 20 years or so, trying to bridge those worlds, the difficult and kind of technical world of Sanskrit jurisprudence with the wider questions in legal studies and legal theory. So for me, that's the niche that I've fallen into as a scholar over some time now.
It was, for me, it was interesting because in law school, I think that's when I first really got exposed to like thinkers like Hart and Bentham from a legal perspective, along with Mill, and later on Dworkin and all these people. But it's fascinating to me that, the positive law system they put forth. And then I started getting into your work about, how Indian law was kind of developed, because large part, none of us knew of what Indian law was, except for the modern colonial law and how that came about. But what was law in ancient India, and what was law in medieval India, and how did they deal with cases, right? Because you read a text and you might read something about like a king had a court, but like, how did he have court? What were the procedures? What were the rules and regulations? And I want to get into that a little bit more later. But before we get into those ideas, what is Dharma, right? At the heart of this is like the most complex term that means so many things to so many people. And I think a lot of times people don't understand it because it is that complex. So what does Dharma mean in a general context, and what does it mean in your area of study? So let's start with Professor Olivelle.
What is Dharma? There is really no answer to that. Dharma doesn't have a meaning.
I knew he would say that, by the way. Yeah.
Sorry?
I knew you would say that.
Dharma has a history, and not a meaning. But then that is also wrong, because Dharma is not a person. Dharma is not a thing. Mm. It is a word and a concept that people use.
Okay.
So in a sense, the meaning of Dharma is what people using that word at different times, different places, the meaning that they gave to the word.
Sure.
That is very diverse. Now, within the general Indian cultural history, Dharma is not a four-legged animal walking down the street. You call that a dog or a cat, right? So in a sense, it has a certain physiognomy but within that broad semantic range, you find different people in different parts of India at different times, using it in very different ways. For example, in the philosophical tradition, Dharma is viewed as a quality of a thing. So blue is a Dharma of a lotus.
Right.
I think that if you tell people that blue is Dharma, they would think that you are talking nonsense today, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that the immense semantic range of this term, and not only is it linguistically diverse in different religious and cultural situations, but the same people will be using that in their writings with a wide variety of meanings. So that's something we have to realize, right? So, and also it was from a religious perspective, a term that was a site of contention. People were trying to define it in different ways. So it was not a given. It was always being pulled one way or the other by the different people. So for the Buddhists, for Ashoka, for the Jains, for the Mimamsakas, for the Advaitins, for the Smartas, for the Pashupatas, they all will have taken this in their own different way, right? So that's, I think, the complexity of the text, of the term. I mean, long time ago, I edited a book actually on Dharma with about, I don't know how many, 20 odd contributions. And there too, I think we were just scratching the surface, you know, I mean, sort of the major hits, so to speak, of Dharma, right? Rather than going into the nitty gritty. And so, yeah, so in a sense, there is no one answer to your question, what is Dharma?
Sure. I mean, like Dharma is used very, very rarely in the Vedas. And it's very like, you know, and it means something different than it does in the Upanishads, than it does in the Itihasas. But, you know, like our modern conception of, outside of the colloquial like language of Dharma as a religion, you know, there has to be a core, right? In what, like where Mahabharata talks about Dharma as being the foundation of society or whatever, or Dharma Sukshma. What would Bhishma mean by Dharma in that term, right? Like it doesn't obviously mean Dharma as blue, if we're talking about in a philosophical sense, as an ontological quality of a thing or essence, but it means something specific within the dynamic that he's talking about. Like, so within the Dharma Shastra tradition, what does Dharma mean? And maybe it does differ depending on whether you're talking about law or you're talking about the religious morality and religious rituals. So what is the range within the Dharma Shastra tradition, semantic range? What does it mean in the tradition itself? Either of you can answer. It'd be fantastic.
Want to take it up, Don?
Okay, I'll take a stab. So I would say that the predominant signification of Dharma within the Dharma Shastra texts, something that I think P.V. Kane would agree with, is Varna Ashrama Dharma. So the Dharma that pertains to social class and to stage of life or mode of life, ashrama. And it that is, I would think, I think the centerpiece, the central framework of Dharma that is used within Dharma Shastra. It does not preclude, nor is it by any means the only sense of Dharma that shows up in the texts. One can immediately point to Sadharana Dharma, which shows up, the dharmas that are common to all people, regardless of Varna or Ashrama, for example. These would be these would tend to be things like common virtues, you know, non-violence and forbearance and patience and you know, things like this that we want everybody to have. It might manifest differently in different communities, which is a way of circling the sadharana dharmas back to people's different contextual situations in life. One of the interesting things, and I was just speaking with a student this morning who's working on a dissertation about the Mahabharata, is that the sukshmata, the subtleness of Dharma in, which is a perennial theme in the Mahabharata, is, well, Dharma is somewhat less sukshma, less subtle in both the Ramayana and the Dharma Shastras, I think. So the Mahabharata is the location more than any other in which the difficulties and challenges of really coming to a kind of firm moral conclusion about any given action plays out more beautifully and more you know, complexly than in any other source that I'm aware of. When you think about the Dharma Shastras in a more narrow sense, the the drive toward resolution and solution is stronger, such that in principle, at least, one should be able to overcome doubts. One should be able to overcome conflicts and come to some kind of solution that is, according to the procedures outlined in the texts, definitive and not subtle at that point, but clear.
Sure. I mean, it's a term I struggle with relatively often, whether, especially like within the Mahabharata itself, there's this, it seems to be an internal struggle within the text itself between, for example, Bhishma's entire vision of what Dharma means versus Yudhishthira's. I think Alf Hittelgittel, again, I mess up his last name, but he does a great job in his book on the education of a Dharma king about laying some of this stuff out. But I find it fascinating that the text itself, it doesn't really have a conclusion as to this, where I feel like Dharma Shastras on the whole, whether individually or the Dharma Sutras, tend to have a more, I would say, non-contradictory view on what Dharma is within text. Although there is contradictions, it seems to be a little more linear in terms of its understanding. But maybe I'm wrong here. It's like, so go ahead, Professor.
Well, I mean, there are two different genres of literature. One is a storytelling, which brings out the complexities of human life.
Sure.
Bimal Matilal wrote several articles and books on the moral dilemmas of the Mahabharata, and that's the dilemma, right? I mean, at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, you find the moral dilemma of Arjuna being played out, right? At the end of the Mahabharata war, you find a similar crisis of conscience of Yudhishthira coming up, right? So those are the beautifully narratively constructed human dilemmas where there are no easy solutions to what is right and what is wrong, kind of.
Right.
The Shastra, on the other hand, is a much more cut and dried kind of thing that they're putting, right? Shastra is the very term Shastra comes from a Sanskrit term, which means instrument of instruction. So in a sense, it's a classroom textbook, which cannot have a lot of moral ambiguity in it. Right? You have to present the truth, right? So it is much less. But if you take a diachronic view of the Dharma Shastra, you find the complexity coming out.
Sure.
For example, take a simple thing like niyoga, the levirate, right? Whether your wife can, produce children for you from other men.
Yeah.
Which is a completely, throughout history, controversial thing, and things like inheritance, whether the primogeniture, the oldest son taking the entire estate, or whether it is divided among everybody. That is not as contentious as the other one, but it was there from the beginning. Right? So those are the kinds of things that you find even in the Shastra, right? When you get to the early ones, I'm working right now on the transcription, searchable, of Haradatta's commentary on the Apastamba Dharma Sutra, which is the oldest Dharma Sutra we have, probably going back to about the 3rd century before Christ, around the same time as Ashoka, by the way, right?
Sure.
And almost every page or every other page, you find the words "ak" coming in. Some people say this without any attempt most of the time to refute that.
Right.
We are talking then about Apastamba bringing out a rich diversity of opinion with regard to what is Dharma within the milieu in which he is constructing this particular text, right? Some people say this, and sometimes he even uses names. Like Haradatta says this, and Pushkara Shadi says this. So so they have this complexity coming out, which are generally eliminated in later Dharma texts, such as Manu. Manu could hardly give this complexity because he's the son of the creator God who is laying down the whole damn thing to you. Right? He can't say, well, there are differences of opinion coming here. Right? So you find the shift from from basically, the complexity of scholarly debate to this uniformity later on. So there is within the Shastric literature too, quite a lot of complexity as to what is Dharma, but not in the same way as the Mahabharata, no.
So, I mean, but we find that complexity, even though it might not be there in individual Dharma Shastras, it comes back in commentaries and probably even Nibandhas, right? When you have the tradition talking about that, doesn't the complexity of the different thinkers, whether it's Manu, Yajnavalkya, Vishnu, or whoever else, come into play in that world?
Right. I mean, at a particular time in Dharma Shastra scholarship, I mean, talk about the traditional scholarship.
Yeah.
The idea came that all Dharma Shastra, the Smritis, say the same thing.
Yeah.
So there cannot be contradictions. So if there seem to be a contradiction, that's our problem. We are not understanding the thing, right? So they're trying to explain it to others. So that's one of the tasks of the Nibandhakara or the persons writing commentary, right?
Right.
But then again, we have within that, somebody is saying, Vijnaneshwara says this, but that is stupid, right? But while this is, so there is that complexity coming in of commentators, major commentators, disagreeing with each other as to how to interpret. But there is always at the back of their mind that there is only one correct way to interpret it. They don't go at the text like we do today, saying that, of course, there are contradictions because one was written 1,000 years before the other.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there has to be differences. They are not talking, they're talking about all these things on a sort of a flat historical plane, right? They're all contemporaneous. They're all the same synchronic texts.
But I know some later thinkers, or like, for example, Prashara in his Smriti, he talks about his being applied for Kali Yuga versus everyone else was like Satya Yuga or whatever Yuga they're writing in. So there must have been some understanding that there were some older texts, some newer texts, and then some middling texts, right? So before we get into that, I mean, can we discuss maybe the history of the Dharma Shastra tradition? Like where it started and where it comes up to, Professor Davis?
Yeah, sure. There are, 3-4 layers textual. I mean, I think we should start by saying that when we're speaking of Dharma Shastras, we're speaking of textual traditions preserved by an intellectual tradition, not text used in courts of law necessarily to, known by a wide swath of society. So we have to keep that elite nature of the text in mind, first of all. But we have a strata of text called the Dharma Sutras, probably dating from around the 3rd century BC to first couple of centuries of the Common Era. And a shift occurs with the creation and solidification of the text that we know as the Manu Smriti or the Manava Dharma Shastra, in which a lot of the materials that were present in the Dharma Sutra traditions, especially those pertaining to household rituals and things surrounding the life of especially of a Brahmin household, get supplemented with a wider array of information pertaining to kingship and to the state. So Manu essentially brings the worlds of the household and the state together, and that gives the Dharma Shastra a new scope. From that time on, then what we would call the law becomes a really important part of the Dharma Shastra tradition that gets expanded and grows over time. So then we have the period that we usually call the Smriti period, textually speaking, that goes from about Manu and really continues on for quite a long time, but at least 1,000 years, let's say, from 2nd century AD CE to 1000 CE, something like that. And this is where the names of other sages are used to grace various collections of wisdom, and some of them are kind of unitaskers, like the Narada Smriti, that is really only about Vyavahara, legal procedure. Some of them are about even what's just one aspect. Some of the minor ones are about just one thing. So Pitamaha is only about ordeals, more or less, for example. But other texts are more comprehensive in scope. Some texts are known to us only through citations that occur in later literature. But all along the way, we have to suspect that there were people who were commenting and teaching and communicating these texts to other students. But at a certain point in time, probably 7th or 8th century, we start to get written commentaries on these earlier Smritis and Sutras. And the commentarial literature then gives us another layer of interest and also another historical layer to examine. So the commentaries would normally take a text as it had been established and comment verse by verse on those. The next major shift then is to take, instead of being interested in commenting on a traditional text in order, you look at things thematically and you select, or topically, and you select the topic that you're interested in and try to gather all of the different Shastra authors on a particular topic, such as inheritance or pilgrimage or gift giving or some other topic, and you create what we would call a digest or an anthology, a Nibandha, to try to distill all of the collected wisdom of the tradition in one place. Those are roughly sort of 4 layers that we tend to speak of. The first Nibandha we have is from the 12th century. This is the Kritya Kalpataru of Lakshmidhara. But after this time, the Nibandha genre and the commentarial genres really, and they kind of have always blended. You know, a lot of commentaries are half Nibandhas and a lot of Nibandhas are half commentaries. So that distinction isn't one that we want to draw too sharply. But what you can see is this development. There's an expanding array of topics considered at each level, but also some reflections on how best to present the tradition to oneself and perhaps to others, especially I would think patrons who are paying for all of this intellectual work. So that's a very brief summary.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. So what would be like the difference outside of like sutra style versus prose style that you get in Manu? What is the real difference of a Dharma Sutra and a Dharma Shastra? And what makes that line occur? I mean, is it just the style of writing, or is there something more to it?
I think much has been made about the distinction between Dharma Shastra and Dharma Sutra, where none exist.
Okay.
There's no distinction between the two. In fact, if you look at the manuscripts, many of the so-called Dharma Sutras are called Dharma Shastra. What we have here is a sutra style of writing. And therefore, it's a genre difference, not a content difference. So when you say Dharma Shastra, it includes both the metrical Smritis as well as the prose sutras. When you say Dharma Sutra, we are referring to a totally different thing, which means Dharma texts that are written in sutra style. So you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Right. So Dharma Shastra is a much broader concept.
Yeah, it's universal.
It is universal. It takes into account everything. Dharma Sutra is a subsection of that. Yes, right. With regard to the content, as Don said, it is not because one is sutra and one is verse. It is because at a particular time in Indian Dharma Shastric history, somebody decided to include a wide array of topics that were not there, at least with equal prominence in the earlier literature, such as the state and the king, right?
Sure.
So that was brought in so that the Arthashastric tradition, which had dealt with those topics in the earlier, gradually disappeared, or it was absorbed into the Dharma Shastric, right?
Right. Okay. I mean, so something like Manu, right? Manu was probably codified roughly 200 to 400 CE, roughly, right? So, but like in the text like Mahabharata, which probably is like, according to Alf, was somewhere between 1st or 2nd century BC. there's still citations of Manu, right? So was Manu at that time probably being developed, and were there parallel traditions of Manu, or how do we think about how a text like Manu would have been developed over time?
Well, Manu is not cited by the Mahabharata. Mahabharata cites verses,
Yes.
or has verses that have in common also the
I see.
Manu. So it is possible that both are drawing from common sources. So one doesn't have to be before the other.
Sure.
That's one way of looking at it. And second is that Manu, at least I think, and this is not accepted by everybody, I think it was a single composition.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly continued to have changes and additions and etc. But it was put together by one person, probably around the 2nd century CE, mostly because it has prominently gold coins as a currency, and gold coins came into India with the Kushanas around the end of the 1st century, right? Yeah. So that's what we have. Mahabharata, on the other hand, had a much more flexible, fungible textual tradition with additions and subtraction going on for much longer period of time. So the influences, if there were any from Manu to Mahabharata, could have happened all the way into the Gupta period. Like Fitzgerald thinks that the final edition of the Mahabharata was put together during the Gupta period. So there's a couple of centuries there where it could have happened.
So how do we think about, like, in the various the Dharma Smritis, whether it's Manu or Yajnavalkya, kind of, are they talking to each other in some sense? Are they responding to each other? And where do they play out? Like, I imagine, like if you're indicating that Manu was probably written by a singular author, it must have been written by a single author in a certain location, a certain milieu, in a certain cultural setting. So, and Yajnavalkya probably written in some other place with somebody else with some other setting. So how do they juxtapose each other in this sense? And how do they converse with each other?
Not with each other, but Yajnavalkya is responding to Manu.
Right.
Okay, Manu was much earlier. So clear, Yajnavalkya, in fact, in my latest edition of this, I tried to show how one verse of Yajnavalkya is actually a abbreviation of several verses of Manu. So you can see the connections going. And he at one point says, Manu at one point says that the levirate, the niyoga, should be done. At another place he says no, and he was trying to. So there was that kind of a connection. Clearly, the guy who wrote Yajnavalkya had Manu before him,
right,
and he knew that text quite well. Yeah, Don, you may want to add something.
The only thing I would say is that you can definitely see a lot of intertextual linkages between the various Dharma Shastras. So that sometimes you'll get whole passages that are repeated from Smriti to Smriti, but attributed to different authors. So sometimes the attributions are a little bit unclear. You can also see that some texts start to make original contributions. So Narada Smriti is a text that introduces a whole variety of new details and specifications regarding legal procedure and the various Vyavaharapadas, the titles of law. We don't find those in other texts, so that's something new. But parts of what Narada has done were already there. Moreover, it's quite impressive and very telling that Manu very quickly became the gold standard within the tradition, so that other texts will constantly say, whatever Manu says is right, and if what we say here is not going to deviate from that, but only elaborate, kind of. So there's a way in which the tradition conceived of itself too as elaborating upon a standard that was set by Manu. But even Manu, right, as Dr. Olivelle has shown multiple times, distills information that existed before him. So the opening sutras of Gautama are, Vedo Dharma Mulam, right? second verse is Tadvidang Smriti Shile. This is exactly the same as another verse, but put in, you add one word, akilo, into the thing to make it a shloka, right? Vedo kilo dharma mulam. But it's the same passage, right? So Manu had Gautama before him. It is that, or something like that, or this was so well known that that they're drawing from a common source. So that I think the construction of Dharma Shastras is a combination of reworking old material, incorporation of new material that also probably pre-existed the author. So that would include something like the incorporation of the Arthashastra, a new kind of topical array of material, and then original contributions of a particular author. So 3 basic inputs is how I usually think about it.
One other thing, if I may, to add to what Don said, is the new vocabulary that is often introduced. For example, Manu doesn't have a word for a document, mostly because it was not an important thing in court cases. There were always live witnesses. But by the time Yajnavalkya comes, documents become central to evidence in a court. So he has the word lekhya, which is for the first time in the Dharma Shastra history, the term is used. Then you have ordeals, divya, which is used for the first time by Yajnavalkya and not used by Manu, who uses the word shapata, which is a term that is used for also oaths. So there's a new technical vocabulary being introduced, and Narada, of course, takes it a step further in this technical vocabulary being used.
So how far do we know if these early Dharma Shastras, whether sutras or later the prose, was this an oral tradition of some sort, or was it actually foundationally a written tradition? And do we have any sense of that?
I mean, orality is such a big part of the transmission of texts in India, and the versification of the early metrical smritis has to be in part a way of reciting them in a familiar format. But ditto, the concision of a sutra style allows you to assimilate a lot of information rapidly. So both are probably related to some kind of oral transmission. At the same time, both the sheer length of some of these texts and the and their open texture as opposed to the Vedas, that is to say, the idea that the precise recitation of a Vedic sukta is such that it has to be transmitted in a pristine form, whereas the a Dharma Shastra text is arthamula, right? It's grounded in meaning, and so you want to get the meaning across, even if you have to add a clarification word here or there. So I think orality was certainly part of it, but as time goes on, written sources become really important. Dr. Olivelle should speak to whether he thinks the texts were originally composed with the help of writing or not.
Yeah, that's of course difficult to tell, but I think there is a false dichotomy often put in the very question you ask. Is it oral or written? In India, it is both oral and written most of the time, right? So that's the other one thing to remember in India. But whether these were originally written documents or not, it really depends on the time, I think. Many of the earlier ones could have been composed orally, but clearly by the time of Manu and later, it was much more of a written tradition, I think. But the reality of this tradition is, I'm just looking at Haridhasa's commentary, and he gives a lot. He's a very good commentator, very sensitive reader, and he gives a lot of variant readings, what we would call variant readings, right? But he says, the way he says that is, it is recited this way here. So he's referring to an oral tradition of the Apastamba that is someplace being recited. And that is, and the very term often used in India for reading is pata. Well, the pata is a reading, meaning oral reading, not visual reading. Right? So you see that that the very words show the orality of this tradition.
So moving on to like the next topic, how do we, we talked briefly about Dharma earlier. How within the Shastra tradition, how can we know Dharma? Like, what are the means to know and understand Dharma from, the Dharma Shastra tradition? Do we have some rules on that, or guides, as better stated?
Can I recite the verse that I started before?
Right.
Well, Dharma, Veda Kilam.
Vedo kilo dharma mulam tadvidangcha smriti shile acharashchaiva sadhunang atmanastushterevacha. This is Manu 2:6. So this is one of the standard classic expositions of the various Pramanas or sources of Dharma. So that Veda is always the first, right? But Veda becomes tricky for reasons that we can talk about. Then the Smriti and the Shila, the recollection and the character of those who know it. That is to say, of those who know the Veda. Then Acharashchaiva sadhunang, the
behavior of good men.
Yes, the customary practice of good men. And finally, then that which pleases a person, Atmatushti, literally that which pleases oneself. But all of these sources, all of these Pramanas were subjected to hedgings and qualifications and descriptions and so forth. And so, but they provide the framework usually of the 3 or 4 sources of Dharma. So, I've written a little bit about Atmatushti and the limitations that were placed around that concept, precisely because it on first glance, it reads like, and whatever you feel like doing, right? Atmatushti, that would be a reasonable translation of that in some context, but that can't be what they meant, right?
Right.
So what they meant is that, either it is the internal satisfaction, what we would call the conviction that what you're doing is right, but really they would say, well, but not just anybody. So because a thief might feel that, well, this is right, but it has to be also a good person who is a knower of the Veda, or a person who is of extraordinary character. Or they say it means that for things in life that don't really matter that much, you can do whatever you want. So which way, I'm trying to think of an Indian example, but I was going to say, do you use a fork or a spoon? But that doesn't really work. But what side of the head do you wear your top knot, or which direction do you tie your sari?
Right.
So that matters, right? There's usually reasons why you do that, but it's somewhat arbitrary according to the tradition, and because I find it matter of Dharma.
Interesting, like if anyone reads any of the Dharma Shastras, they're incredibly onerous, right? Like sometimes it'd be like lightning strikes and you have to go take a shower, you can't check the Vedas, so a donkey walks by. It's just it's almost as if like especially for the Brahmanas who it's mostly talking to, it's very, very like anything in life that's not perfected, it's like this, you have to do some prayaschitta, right? It's your entire life is devoted to this. So it almost seemed very difficult for me to think of where does Atmatushti here work, right? Like it's what is the scope here? And are they talking, when he talks about Atmatushti, is he talking about like sadharana, like people, everyday people, or is he talking about Brahmanas in particular, or a particular class of people? I mean, so I get jumbled up with some of this stuff.
Yeah, for that particular concept. Yeah, that's right. So it's, the tradition itself ends up defining most of the parameters of things. But as a technical matter, Atmatushti is either a guide that comes from the behavior of really famous, extraordinary people, or something that pertains only to trivial matters where it doesn't matter how you do it.
Right.
And so that drastically narrows the scope of what it is, which is why only Manu and Yajnavalkya mention this source, and then they give it up. Nobody else talks about it.
Right. So are these hierarchies? Is it first, Veda, and then it's and then the Shila, and then Acara, and then Atmatushti? So if none of those three other sources work, then Atmatushti is allowed, is my guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is Dharma Pramana is a very complex thing.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you saw my Dharma Reader text.
Yes,
book.
I have it.
So in my first part of it is Dharma Pramana, trying to see it across time diachronically. It is a very, very difficult area, very complex area, because the Mimamsakas come on the one hand, giving the most conservative thing. Veda is the only, right?
Yeah.
And you find that, people like Medatiti comes and says, oh shit, we can't do, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have.
No, you can cuss. I cuss all the time. It's fine.
Delete that. We can't really do that because, you go to the Raja Dharma or the Vyavahara, right? You can't find any Vedic text to support these things, right? So there are real problems there, I think. But one thing, when we are dealing with the Dharma Pramana within the Brahmanical tradition, one has to look at the subtexts of them. What are they? Whom are they talking against? Because there were other people also who said, this is the Dharma Pramana. The Buddhists came and said, Buddha Vachana. So the words of the Buddha is Dharma Pramana. So there are all the other ways of contextualizing what they are saying, because they were, what I tried to say is that when we go to Apastamba, he says, at the very beginning, he doesn't say anything about the Veda. He says, Samaya Acharikan Dharman Vyakyasyama Dharmanya Samaya Pramanam. That's what I start with. So Dharma is the agreement, the Acara that is agreed upon by people. By whom? By people who know the Dharma, bit of a tautology there. Then at the end, he comes and says, Vedascha, right? As also the Veda. So we are talking about what they're trying to show here is that community standards, especially community standards of authoritative Brahmanical communities, become the criterion for the Dharma, as opposed to the Buddhists who are saying the authority is the one day a guy sat under a tree and got this whole damn thing, and here is the Dharma, right? He says, no, that doesn't work, right? That doesn't work. The charismatic, experiential thing. So in a sense, there are all these other sides to the Brahmanical take on this matter.
So on that point, so even when we talk about, as Veda Moolam, as the root of the Vedas, but the Vedas don't have much to say on a lot of this stuff. So when they're talking about using the Veda as like the first source, what are they trying to mean here? What are they trying to say? Because it doesn't say much about how people should do a certain thing. I mean, maybe the Brahmanas have some notions here and there, and Upanishads have some pieces here and there, but it doesn't really give rules on how to live.
It's as good as Vedic mathematics and physics. So Veda becomes just a term. It's like, today Christians would say biblical theology, right?
Sure. I
mean, much of it may not come from the Bible at all.
Right.
So that's the side of it, I think, and when you go into the Mimamsa and Medatiti, they find very difficult to maintain. So there's this whole theory of a lost Veda. The Vedas, some of the Vedas that contain these things are lost. And
they refer to that, don't they?
Huh?
They refer to that sometimes where if we're saying something, we're actually referring to a lost Veda that doesn't exist anymore.
Right, exactly, right. There are various ways of trying to say that what is found in the Acara and the Smriti are actually based on the Veda. And then they have the concept what is called Anumita Shruti. The Shruti, the Veda that is inferred to have existed, as opposed to Pratyaksha Shruti, the Veda that we actually find recited. Right. So there are always various hermeneutical gymnastics that's been performed in order to come up with this. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's very similar to the enshrinement of the natural rights, right? In Western parlance, where there's natural rights exist somewhere, and we kind of like work backwards to develop it. So it's fascinating because if the Vedas don't talk about it, then they really are talking about what a group of people decide is going to be good behavior, and it's been good behavior for generations or generational. Would that be fair to say? Like, but they also have a sense of like, there's seems to be some diversity. Well, this might be good for the Brahmanas. There's different like rules, but they don't really talk about many of the rules for other communities. It's very like superficial. It's kind of glossed over, right? Like, you know, especially when you get to the conversation about Shudras, it's just service of others. There's not much talked about. But so how did these communities, I guess it goes to this question is, did the Shastras reflect real world, or were they just kind of the world of imagination or perfected world that the authors wanted to have?
Yes. So this is the perennial dilemma that we deal with in our field, which is trying to relate the what I would call the ideological project of the Dharma Shastra tradition writ large, and I wouldn't say that is univocal or a singular agenda, but I think each author had some kind of ideological drive, a motivation grounded in what they wanted to achieve through their text that then only partially captures, and in some ways because of the restrictions of the tradition, only rarely touches the ground, so to speak. Yeah. And so the historical realities that existed at the time are very difficult to see within the texts. Typically, we look either for corroborative evidence external to the texts that we can use to try to match the sources and do our best to come up with a plausible history, or we read the text transgressively to look for cues and hints of places where a reference to something like gold tells us that it must be after a certain date, or it must be of this particular time period. Or if we have a reference to cross-cousin marriage, boom, we know this is a South Indian author. Right. Things like this. And so there are things that we encounter frequently that give it our tells or cues that we would rely upon. But one of the fun parts about what Dr. Olivelle and I do is precisely to look for those places where, hey, I found something interesting here that I don't think people had seen before about the history. So one of my favorite pieces that Dr. Olivelle wrote not so long ago was about what kind of furniture gets mentioned in the old texts. And what does that tell us about the social, the economic status of the people involved? Right. And the argument was that these people were pretty well off, because there's a lot of talk of beds and chairs and things like this, and only he would notice what references to furniture. But it's a tell, right? It's a way of looking at the kind of implied audience and implied authorship of these sorts of texts. But it's such a difficult thing to relate any given text to a particular social context, and it's only very rarely that we can do that. As we get closer to our own time, some texts become easier to connect to places and times, but especially for the early material, it's quite challenging.
Every now and then you get a clue, geographical clue, for example. Yajnavalkya Dharma Shastra begins with Yajnavalkya having some kind of a samadhi in Mithila. So we have now put a geographical location there, right? Now it may not have been written in Mithila, but at least the author is thinking about Mithila as the location of his text, right? In the Dharma Shastra of Vishnu, there is a description of Mother Earth standing in between the feet of Vishnu. Mm-hmm. And this is found only in the iconography of Kashmir. Nowhere else. So now we can locate, oh, this is a text coming from Kashmir. Right? So there are certain clues like that where we can do that. But I think the discussion, the debate about Dharma Shastras, was it, descriptive or normative, or prescriptive, or whether the laws in Dharma Shastra were actually enacted in a court of law. I think it's somewhat misplaced, because I think any text, especially ancient text, would have a similar issue, right? We can't take it as fact. We can't take yesterday's New York Times as telling us facts about America, right? It is through the lens provided by various people, right? So it's somewhat different. Our friend Stephanie Jamison has used the term reading between the lines. She's working on women's histories, but women's are often not there in text. So how do you find women in text, right? So you have to go to what is not said, the so-called silences I talk about, rather than what they say, right?
Sure.
So there are various ways in which we can look at it. If you look at Varna, we talked about Varna, right? So is Varna a descriptive thing in the Dharma Shastras or a prescriptive thing? Are they talking about real world in which there are 4 Varnas? Or are they talking about a Brahminical ideology which required there to be 4 Varnas, but nobody else knew about it?
Well, I mean, this is, but the thing is, like, a lot of what you're saying, at an intellectual level, it's fascinating, it's amazing, and I love to explore that. But there's also the real world impact we have in politics, you see, in conversations. So the work you do is very important, because it can elucidate what is potentially fiction, what is potentially fact, and then kind of like what in between we can't know. So, like, for example, like, when we talk about a Varna system of when the texts, they have seems to be a very built-in system of, like, this is how things function. There's these stratas, here's how people should function, here's how it should roll. But it appears to me, when you look at both any evidence we get from archaeology or epigraphs or so on, is the world was a little more chaotic than that. Vastly more chaotic. How would that have ever functioned for any sort of ruler to try to curtail traders coming in from across different places across the world, movements of people that you don't know what jati or varna they belong to, or how do they fit into, like, that? It doesn't seem to fit the world of reality. Is my thought. But maybe you guys have different opinions on this.
I think every application of a limited system along the lines of Varna applied to a society is always a fiction that is being deployed for some kind of purpose. That purpose might be political, it might be religious. If we think about the limited categories of race that we have to check off in the United States on various forms, that hardly captures the realities of people's racial backgrounds and identities and so forth. So we have to interpret the Varna categorization, I think, in similar kinds of terms. It was almost certainly never, not almost certainly, I would say certainly never a reality of four groupings, but always an afterthought, a kind of sociological classification of broad groupings, but a sociological classification that came with an undercurrent of agenda, or of especially privileging Brahmins on the one hand and Kshatriyas on the other, with the Vaishyas and Shudras occupying a very small space as almost afterthoughts in the scheme. So the question then becomes who used this system and for what purposes, right? And how then do the myriad jatis that show up in various sources from early on fit or don't fit into this system? And so it was part of certain kinds of Brahminical agendas to reclassify jatis under one of these four. But this was also part of a a deliberate move, a conscious move to simplify and make everything work within the fourfold scheme that, as Dr. Olivelle said, it had to axiomatically from the beginning. So you make the world fit the reality that you want it to fit.
I mean, the question we can ask at any time in Indian history is how many people living in India at that time in a geographical area identified themselves, oh, I'm a Vaishya.
Yeah.
I'm a Shudra.
Yeah.
I would say very little, if any. I've been working for a long time now on Ashoka and his inscriptions. The word Varna, the word Shudra, the word Vaishya, word Kshatriya does not occur, right? So for Ashoka, Varna and the Varna designations did not exist. Or if it did, it didn't play any significant role in his own thinking, right? Then we come 1,000 years later to Andhra Pradesh.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this Cynthia
Talbot.
Talbot.
Our friend Cynthia Talbot has worked on that, right? Inscriptions. Yeah. No one has ever identified themselves there in the inscription as one of these four. Right? They were always identified themselves in various kinds of titles, right? Nothing to do with this. Now, there could well have been these four, existing in some area of consciousness, right? But they were not the ones, dominating ones with regard to one's own self-identity.
Sure. A part of that, like, I think this is also touching upon like something, Dr. Davis, you've written is about the corporate groups, right? The various, these guilds. I mean, I guess guilds maybe, or something of that nature. But obviously, they had a lot of political power, social power within the area, wherever they were. I couldn't imagine that they felt unable to do things in the society they're in based upon Brahminical ideas of what they could or couldn't do. So there has to be some like level of where these texts occupied and where they didn't occupy. And I think it seems to be like it, from my assessment, it seems like it occupies the minds of a lot of Brahmin thinkers, but it maybe influenced some Kshatriya kings, or some rulers at some level, but I don't know what that would have been, right? Because like, I don't think we could talk, there's any kingdom that we know for certain or time period in India where a king followed Manava Dharma Shastra and tried to set out the rules. I just don't know if that existed.
No, there were some kings who dabbled in this, like, King Bhoja, the man was supposed to have written on Dharma Shastra, right? And Lakshmidhara, talks about his patron. And Apararka himself was a king or somebody who wrote for him and gave him the authorship of this book. So there are some things like that, but clearly they are elite minority. The question to ask is, what you said just now, for whom are these books written and who's reading them?
Right.
And so this is scholastic tradition, but very important in Indian history. That's why the literature is important, because there's the longest literary tradition in India. Yeah. Continuous, unbroken. And these people knew each other. They were talking to each other. So this is a literary tradition that was nurturing itself over the years. Yeah.
So however fictional the categorization of something like Varna is, if things are repeated often enough, they become influential, right? And that, I think, is part of what happens, is that the sheer repetition of this and the expansion, thanks to a lot of academic scholarship and now politicians and so forth, the repetition of the Varna ideology, I think, has a way of making it seem real. Well, I mean, that's tricky.
And the reason I ask is, like, when we talk about, like, in the past 500 years of, say, like the race theory in the West, it becomes codified into law at some level. So do we have any sense if Varna was ever codified before the colonial era and the colonial like project of trying to understand these texts and incorporate a Hindu law? Was there a tradition of before that having that some sort of incorporation into law of Varna at some level?
I can't think of the kind of differentiation. I can't think of examples that I would say are verified historical examples where there's a lot of differentiation. But the texts themselves, of course, speak extensively about differential punishments and differential kinds of fines and whatnot that are given to people based upon their social status and Varna status in particular. So I think we have to infer there that there likely were differentiations made in practice, but we don't have a lot of on the ground evidence for it. So just to circle back briefly to your question about corporate groups, I love instances where the Dharma Shastras point to worlds of law that are separate from itself. And this is one of those areas where there's clearly a whole world of lawmaking and law enforcing that goes on external to the Dharma Shastra text that is acknowledged as legitimate within the Dharma Shastras, but is happening according to its own rules.
Sure.
And there I suspect that, as Dr. Olivelle was saying a second ago, the evidence that we have from inscriptions and so forth tends to downplay a lot of the things that we've come to expect from Dharma Shastra, such that Varna and Jati and so forth are much less prominent in epigraphical sources than in Brahminical sources.
Except maybe for just lip service. Often the king is said to be the Varna Ashrama Dharma protector, right?
Or something.
How much, what that meant is not said.
No,
That's right.
So on that point, so I want to go to the next topic is kind of like, what is Raja Dharma, and also what we talked about these corporate groups, and what was the relationship between the state and these corporate groups, right? Like how did that play out? Either in the text or what we know from actual on the ground evidence.
So I actually think it was. This is my professor answer. I think it was pretty variable. That is to say, I think there were places where there were very strong kings who had pretty extensive and fairly well managed administrative apparatuses, and their corporate groups may have been more under the thumb of a particular ruler. I think there are flip side examples where there were kings who were figureheads, who were basically at the mercy of powerful corporate groups who were operating in their domain, and they had to do their best to placate those groups at every turn in order to make in order to try to retain their own position without being deposed or threatened or worse at a personal level. So I think that there's variability there, right? So there were oftentimes very weak kings in the state of Kerala or the region of Kerala where I've done some work. And there, I think kings were desperate to hold on to some kind of power, and they needed either Brahmin communities or mercantile communities or temple authorities to support them in order to hold on to their power. But then there are other places not so far away in Tamil Nadu where some of the Chola kings, for example, seem to have had fairly rigorous administrative systems in place for managing large-scale governmental projects of various kinds. And you don't do that without having some control over the corporate groups who are going to end up doing that work.
And by corporate groups here, we can think of them as guilds, right? Where collections.
It's a combination. So it might be military groups of various kinds. It could be ascetic communities. So that would be monastic communities if you're thinking about Buddhists and Jains, but also mattas. In some places, right? If you think of the Sringeri Matta, for example, it has incredible land holdings and vast, power and land and wealth. But then you're also thinking about so they're kind of mercantile associations of various kinds, the 500s and the 600s, and groups that show up in the inscriptions, or the Anjuvanam and the Manigramams of South India. And these communities are not guilds in the sense of people who are practicing a particular craft, right? So when we think of a guild, we think of the potters or the washers or the leather workers or something like that. And those guilds were there too. But then these mercantile communities exist independently of all of this. So it's pretty diverse, actually, of the array of different kinds of corporate groups that would be there.
There is one that our friend Tim Lubin has been working on, a particular inscription, stone inscription of Vishnu Sena, a king. What is it? About the 6th century, something like that.
592, I think.
Okay, so 6th century inscription, which is actually a set of rules that the king has approved by which this particular group could live. So there are obligations on the group and the obligations on the king. The king can do X, Y, and Z, and these people have to provide taxes, etc., to the king. So that's an interesting example of king approving special. This word that is used in the Dharma Shastras for this group law is called samaya. Right? So the samaya is what it falls under. So that Buddhist Vinaya, for example, would be a similar thing. So that they can impose the Buddhist Vinaya on the Buddhist monks, and the state recognizes that and does not intervene.
Interesting. In that regard, so what do we know about the theory of Indian kingships in vis-a-vis like European kingships, right? European kingships as a monarch or strong central power authority. What kind of role did the government envisioned by the Shastras, and then maybe how it really played out? I mean, as you said, Dr. Davis, it probably was all over the map, some strong kings, some weak kings. But what was the Dharma Shastra vision of what a king was? Was it supposed to be a strong central king, or was it more administrator, and kind of, what was the idea within the Dharma Shastra tradition?
Patrick, you should start this one.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, I think on the whole, the Dharma Shastras subscribe to a vision of a king as almost divine, be appointed. At least that's Manu's, taking portions from the Lokapalas, created this entity. So it's a sacred institution. So, but it does not deal with the reality of state administration, but an idealized view of kingship, right? So that doesn't help us, because you're asking a historical question, and the answer coming from this is much more of an ideological statement of what a king is, right? Yeah.
So I guess I let me narrow this down a little more. There's also the parts of the Indian theory of kingship is kind of social contract, right? At least in the Mahabharata, they talk about the law of the fish, the Matsya, where big fish eat small fish, therefore they go to a king to appoint, or a person to appoint him king, and that person was Manu in the Mahabharata tradition. But how does that play out to what like Manu thinks about what kingship is within his version of kingship?
Me, that view of kingship, the contractual view of kingship, occurs every now and then. For example, in the justification for taxes, right? You pay taxes because the king, it's an insurance scheme, right? So he has to, you pay taxes and he protects you, that kind of. But I don't know, Don, whether you can sort of add to this. I don't see that in the Raja section, chapter 7 of Manu, where you would, it's much more of almost a divine nature of the king that is brought out in that. Yeah, right. So that at least in Manu, in other texts like Yajnavalkya, deals less so with it's much more dealing with the king and his duties rather than what a king is or how he gets his authority how he exercises it. Yeah, right.
So the classic points of reference are that a king is there to maintain the social orders, so the Varnas and the Ashramas, and so it's interesting because it circles back that the texts provide for an institution, the institution of the king, to secure that core framework of Varna Ashrama Dharma that animates the Dharma Shastra from the beginning. But then the king is also said to be the protector of the people at every turn, right? That this is what the king's major duty is. The primary manifestation of that protection, though, in the Dharma Shastras has to do with the adjudication of disputes and the imposition of punishments of people who are either hurting other people or hurting the state. And so the checking of the bad guys, the dushta nigraha, is everywhere mentioned as this is why we have to have trials, and this is why we have to have punishments, and the application of punishment is the way to secure stability, peace, and prosperity for a given state. And so at that point, then the king becomes the hatchet man for the Brahmin agenda, right? That they need somebody to do the dirty work of the state, and the king is, in that classic conception, the person who takes care of that for the benefit of all, including the Brahmin community and other classes. But that, I think, is sort of the classical framework of how this goes. This becomes rhetorical primarily at best in practical contexts. I don't know that, except as a kind of something you might learn along the way growing up, this ever really was the kind of motivational factor for actual Indian kings, who I think operated from
very human perspective.
The usual
power, money, whatever, all that.
Right,
stuff.
but but some of them were hereditary kings, and they were surely terrible administrators or terrible warriors, and just like every other place in the world, that politics makes things super messy. So,
but I did find it interesting that the Indian conception of state power, in some sense, was based on force, right? Danda. Like, it was really, I mean, maybe I haven't read enough of European political theorists in many ways. I have, but I just don't remember right now. I didn't get that sense of power as being like the source of all the power of punishment, the rod of punishment being the source of state power, which is how we think about it a lot of times today, right? When we talk about the power of the state to enforce punishments, to protect our borders, or so on and so forth. It seemed to me it was a very somewhat realistic take on what the role of the state was.
Monopoly of power, I guess, right, is what they talk about in terms of the state. In India, of course, you have two things, right? As Don talking about is you have, on the one hand, an ideological justification for the fact that this one guy is king and no one else, right? You have to sort of, in Japan, they said that he's coming from, the sun goddess, right?
Right.
Heavenly mandate in China. In India, you have, I think, two schools. One is the divine kingship school, and the other, for which Buddhism contributed a lot, is called Mahasattama, I think, right? How did that go, Don?
Mahasammata.
Sammata, not Sattama. Mahasammata, the great one for whom people have consented. Basically, the theory of creation of society was that Matsya Nyaya was there. Everybody was, it was in chaos. So somebody had to come and impose order, and that's the king. So I had these two competing theories of, and sometimes a little bit of both gets,
mixed together.
In practice, right?
So Professor Dr. Davis, you mentioned briefly again about like one of the important roles of the king was the adjudication of trials and so on. I was recently reading your article about principles and maxims within the Indian context, where, you know, historically people thought that Indians or the Indian subcontinent didn't have like a system of stare decisis or, you know, case law or any way to think about that. And I think your work and the few other people you quoted was very interesting to show that they did, but it wasn't the way we think about it in Anglo-American traditions. It had its own tradition. Could you talk maybe a little bit about like what the legal systems of India, to your extent, understanding kind of were and how they functioned?
So the kind of direction I was pointing to in that article is how does any legal system, and in this case Hindu law, grapple with a sense of the past in order to develop some continuity of legal rules over time.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense at all that a tradition would agree to adjudicate like cases differently. Right? So they have to have some mechanism for ensuring some consistency of the application of the rules in judicial context. And maxims, I think, was one way to do that in Hindu law, but you know, perhaps not. Well, certainly not the only, and maybe not even the primary one. I have a feeling that the domain of Acara that we've talked about before, which is a term that I see show up in lots of different contexts, in practical dated contexts a lot. That this was the conceptual domain under which a lot of routinization of the law occurred, such that it would be the customary practice of a particular desha to observe this and that procedure with regard to a crime, with regard to a civil dispute, with regard to boundary issues, whatever the civil or criminal issue may be. But what we don't have is a lot of detailed information about how people understood what the Acara was in their particular place. So the promulgation of the law side there becomes difficult to understand.
Right.
But nevertheless, the way that it gets invoked in Kerala, at least, is you would get convicted according to the desha Acara, right? So they would say, you know, according to the law of our little region, our territory, the law of the land, we would say,
yeah,
this is what we did. So that, I think, sets a kind of precedent that leaves a mark. And I know about it because it was written down and in some temple archives, but I don't think it was written down in this kind of systematized way that we find in the common law system as it develops in England, or, you know, any kind of registers like that. So that differentiation is a matter of degree rather than of quality, you know, of like total differentiation. The Hindu law tradition is cognizant of its own past and is trying to develop some mechanisms for consistency, but that the way that gets played out tends to be something that's a level beneath the texts as we see them. It's happening in vernacular, it's happening in regional languages, it's happening in word of mouth as it gets passed within communities. And we see attestations of that in the Dharma Shastras without the details that happen underneath.
Now, how would for example, how would a trial have functioned, or a case in Indian world? Like it to me in the past, like how do we have a sense, like, you know, we have a sense of how it worked in Rome, because they have a lot of documentation around this. And even in the medieval period, when we look at the church, right, the church history explains how they have their back and forth. How did it work in India? Oh, do we know?
So yeah, go ahead.
We do not know. I mean, we know the theory.
Okay.
There's a lot of theory. I was asked to write a section on legal procedure for a Cambridge comparative history of of ancient law. It was very easy for me to do in terms of how the legal procedure is described.
Sure.
Whereas Akkadians and the Egyptians and the Chinese could bring cases, how they were actually educated.
Right.
but they had no theory behind it. The superstructure was not there, right? So you had the exact inversion in India. We have minute details about how to do the stuff, but nothing about how it was done. But Acadians and Chinese had all the case law. So we have that, I think. But one thing I want sort of maybe indicate as a possible stare decisis kind of thing is, I think there was the judicial process, the people who were making decisions were at some level professionalized. They were professional people. We do not know how they were trained, where they came from, none of this. But there were people with names and titles who were appointed to that position. In the Arthashastra, which is the earliest document case of Indian law, we have an office called Dharma Shastra. The third book of the Arthashastra is completely devoted to that person, right? He was not just a judge, but also a justice of peace, meaning there are certain other civil functions he performed. And in a court, had to have 3 dharmastas together as a bench.
Sure.
So which is interesting, so
Right.
that they didn't trust one person to do the whole 3, right? But these had a title. What training they had, we do not know. But when we come to the Dharma Shastra, dharmasta disappears. The word doesn't occur, right? And then you have something called Prada Vivaka, who probably was a guy who just presided over the thing. He was a Brahmin, but may not have not known that. But he has very interestingly 3 people whom in English people have called them assessors. In the Sanskrit, they call them sabhya. Right? There were again 3 of them, just like the master, who were the people who were actually advising the people on the law and the facts of the case. So who were they? How were they? How did they know the precedents? Did they know how the court functioned over the years?
Yeah.
Did they have an oral tradition about how other courts managed? So this is the thing that we do not know anything about, right? But that there must have been something similar, I think is most probable.
There are tantalizing scraps of evidence about court cases that we find in what are called Jayapatras, documents of, winning a court case. But the truth is, we have probably less than 10 from any part of India.
How old are these?
It's not very old, actually. Most of them are 18th century. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes the last quarter of the 18th century, which is also suspicious because the British are already in India by that point. We have Jayapatras from Indonesia, though, which is interesting. And so why would something that's talked about in India be transported to Indonesia and leave a record there, but not back in India? So we suspect that there must have been more Jayapatras, but why don't we have a few more of them? I mean, after all, a handful or 10 is very, very small. Yeah. Just the sheer accidents of history should have left a bigger mark. So that makes one suspicious about how these things were actually conducted. Were Jayapatras, which are a critical part of the theory of judicial procedure, implemented in courts? If they were, how do you explain that we don't have very many? And this is a conundrum that I can't answer. And you'll get the usual range of responses, right? Skeptics will say, well, this proves that Dharma Shastra was all, fantasy. And then you'll get defenders who will say, well, India is a difficult climate, and why would you keep this victory document for more than a generation or 2? You only need it for a little while, and some reasonable explanations. But it's just tricky to get to the details of things. So most of the time when it comes to practical matters like this, you have to read other sources between the lines. So I was mentioning some of these things about Kerala that I worked on for my dissertation long ago, and the reason we know about them is because there were little stories written in the temple archives about property that came and went into the temple's coffers. And so when a certain person was executed for committing a murder in the village, the temple inherited his cloak and a silver vessel and some other things.
Wow.
And it's the record of the income that the temple had that they wrote the story down. You know, it's kind of like, why did we get this stuff? And we got it because he murdered somebody else nearby. And so they didn't mean to leave a record of the case, right? But they did it indirectly. So it's a peculiar set of circumstances that we wish desperately we knew more about, because it's frustrating to deal with only the theoretical side.
Absolutely. So I know we have to go soon, but I just have a couple of questions left, and then we can close out. So for you, Dr. Davis, so I loved your book, by the way, on business law and Dharma Shastra, and I thought it was fascinating that how you thought about, there is some information in the Dharma Shastras about how business should be conducted, but I love the idea that you brought out about being relationships. It was really about maintaining and producing relationships that can be fruitful. Can you talk a little bit about like that idea that you brought to the table?
Sure. So I think the easiest way to do that is to contrast it with the alternative, which is to say that everything would be based on a contract.
Right.
And so normally when we think about business relationships, we think these days about, well, what does the contract say, and what do we owe, and what, right? So that kind of stipulation. And time and again in the Dharma text, I think we see that while contracts are certainly talked about and discussed in some detail, the underlying drive is constantly about ways in which the relationships between people need to supersede the contractual obligations that exist between them, so that of course, if a conflict arises, you may fall back on a contract as
right.
we would, but in general, relationships were encouraged as the foundation for business transactions, that we, the proverbial handshake and the proverbial sort of understanding and so forth were a much better way to organize a long-term and socially beneficial set of business practices than to do things in a strictly kind of contractual way where everybody's trying to preserve their own. And that I think speaks to the larger point that I tried to make in that book around the idea that profit is perfectly legitimate, but not at the expense of social good. Right. So that labha can't degenerate into lobha, and so profit can't become greed. Otherwise, it's not dharma anymore. And so it's that sense that virtue and relationships and connections have to be at the foundation of business for it to be righteous or dharmic, I think is really important one, and may contain a lesson for us today.
Yeah, and I actually took that to heart. So I started trying to think about in my business, how can I bring that to the table instead of just being like, well, the contract says this. What is it that we're trying to achieve together, and how do we make that work, even though one side may have breached, other side may have breached, whatever, to make that work that's going to be conducive for everyone around us. It's a very different, being a former lawyer, I was in cases where everyone would just be, you broke the contract, I want you to pay me. But it was just constant like confrontation that kind of made me get out of the law, because I was like, I don't want to keep fighting. Everything doesn't always have to be a fight. And so I did appreciate that. I think that's something we could take to heart and think about and I hope you do more work like that, where you're trying to focus on like these areas that might impact us today, the way you think about things.
Yeah, I guess it goes to first principles, really, how because there's always going to be irresolvable conflicts that have to have some kind of neutral way to adjudicate and solve. But short of that, there are often more reasonable relationship-centered resolutions that people don't often want to explore these days for various reasons. Right.
And Dr. Olivelle, so I know you just worked on a book on Grihasta Ashrama and kind of its connections to early Indian thought. Could you talk briefly about that? And then I have a question from someone when they found out I was talking to you guys that they wanted me to ask you, particularly about this. So if you can,
Yeah.
please.
Well, first, it's not Grihasta Ashrama, just Grihasta.
Oh, sorry, just Grihasta.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
You're bringing in a different category there.
Yeah, I apologize.
Which is important, but well, I mean, this is something that was discovered in the context of both Professor Davies and I were editing this book on the history of Dharma Shastra.
Yeah.
And within that context, we asked Professor Stephanie Jamieson to do the section on the household within the Dharma Shastra tradition. So she, being a philologist, just went to say, okay, let me see where the term Grihasta comes from. Mm-hmm. And she couldn't find any. The term did not exist prior to the Dharma Shastras. So that's how this whole thing started. The earliest evidence we have for the term Grihasta is the Prakrit inscriptions of Ashoka.
Interesting.
Okay, so that's where this whole book came into being. And Grihasta really is, in the Ashokan inscription, always contrasted to the pravrajita. So it's interesting, pravraj, the motion out, going away, to Grihasta, staying at home. So you have the stay at home and the gone forth being contrasted as two different, but equally valid and holy. And that's important, holy. I could almost say ascetic lifestyles. So you can understand how within the early Dharma Shastras, you find a Grihasta, you said everything is controlled.
Yeah.
Earlier, right?
Yeah.
From brushing your teeth to going to the toilet,
everything.
Every little detail, right? Dawn had this interesting term in your book, right? What did you say? The
theology of ordinary life.
Yeah. The little things, right? The dharma of little things, not God of little small things. God of small, right? Of little things. And that's, I think, to a degree where we are coming from. The Grihasta of the Dharma Shastra is a holy man.
Yeah.
It's almost fit in the context of the Bavarian inner worldly asceticism. That's what you're talking about. So I think that's where we came from, and then it gave me new insights into the origin of the Dharma Shastric genre of literature, which is new. And I think we are dealing here with the theology, as Dan said, or the Shastra dealing with the Grihasta within one formulation of this dichotomy between the going and the staying. Is this theory, new theory, formulated by some Brahmins about the ashramas, right? If you look at the earliest articulation of this system in the Apastamba Dharma Sutra, it comes as an afterthought. He has finished his entire text.
Yeah.
And then at the very end of the second Prashna book, it is sandwiched between the Grihasta, which has been gone the entire book describing, and the Raja Dharma section that follows, just 3 sections or 4 sections. Within that, there is this little appendix almost on the ashramas, right? It sort of remains outside the structure of his book. So that's very, very interesting. So it's something new, something coming into the tradition. As I said, he uses the word AK all the time. Some people say this is this. Some people saying there are 4 ashramas, right? The kind of thing. So that is, I think, where we get the theory of the Grihasta within the Brahmanical tradition, at least within the Brahmanical tradition as represented by the Dharma Shastras.
Right.
Because in the Brahmanical tradition, much larger. So in that sense, it makes sense that he talks principally about the Brahmanical Grihasta. Interestingly, Apastamba does not use the word Grihasta. outside of the ashrama section. He used the word Griha Medhin. Griha Meda. Meda is a sacrifice. So house sacrifice. So it sort of connects more ritually to the Vedic tradition.
Right.
So that's so within that you find, I think, the reevaluation of what a stay-at-home Grihasta lifestyle is and we do not know from Ashoka whether the Grihastas were married or not.
Right.
It doesn't tell us that. But within the Dharma Shastra tradition, for the most part, they are married.
Yeah.
If they're married, they have children, they have wife, they have an economic side of a life. But of course, the Brahminical householders don't have an economic life.
Right.
Because their way of getting money is to teach, to officiate at sacrifices, and to get gifts.
Gifts.
So all three, not sort of real world economic production, right?
Sure.
Not agriculture or anything like that. So they're having a different kind of a lifestyle.
That sounds fascinating, and I have it, and I'm going to read that book. So I have one more question. This is from a friend of mine for you, Dr. Olivelle. He's asking, what do you think of Louis Dumont's work on the renouncer versus man of the world as undergirding many of the tensions and developments in Hindu thought?
Yeah. So we are going back to the mid 1960s.
Yeah.
Before Don was born. So maybe both of you. Yeah. So I was a great fan of Dumont early in my career, but it's not something that I deal with right now. I think he comes from a structuralist anthropological background. Levi Strauss and that. I don't think, as of now, as my thinking, that he adds a lot to our understanding of the Indian religious history. His view of the man in the world versus the world renouncer, the dichotomy there, the individualism and the sort of the lack of the individuality on this side. It is interesting. It's interesting to think about, but once you get into the nitty-gritty, I'm not sure whether it stands the kinds of interactions that you find between the so-called world renouncer and society are much more integral. So yeah, I personally don't use Dumont very much, and especially I was disaffected with him a lot more within the context of the Varna and caste, the famous homo hierarchicus thing, which also he has a superstructure of Indian society and how everything fits in, which I think is wonderful on paper, but doesn't give us that much more insight into how things actually were.
I think I was a little more on A.M. Haukart's view on that over Louis Dumont.
Right.
So, but no, we could talk some more, but, I know you've taken so much of your time, and, I really appreciate it. Do you both have any last thoughts or ideas and that you want to, tell our viewers about any of these texts or anything you're working on, or how they can reach you also?
I guess I would just say that we need more people working on Dharma Shastra. Actually, it's a field that's so incredibly rich, but there's a vanishingly small number of people who are really ready to put in the time to work on the tradition. And there are places to study this tradition, and it rewards study manyfold. So I just want to send out a word out there to anybody who might be listening, who's an undergraduate or early graduate student, that think about Dharma Shastra as your field.
For me, I think what I have learned over the last 50 years is that knowledge is so provisional. What I say today is okay for the next maybe year or two. New things will come. One chapter in that book of mine that you referred to, Grihasta, is basically revising my views expressed in the 1993 book on the Ashrama system, because the Grihasta theory gave us a completely new lens to look at that whole thing, which I did not have at that time. So everything, just like in physical sciences, right? Where new theories come, every couple of years or less. In our fields, not that quickly, but new theories come and new ways of looking at things come. And so whatever we said today, take it with a grain of salt.
One finding can change it all. Absolutely. So thank you both for your time. And, hopefully at some point we can have you both on again. To talk. Pavana Muni Jana Yamuna Tire, Pavana Muni Jana Yamuna Tire, Gayati Vanamali, Gayati Vanamali.